feature Carolyn Newton-Curry and her book, In Conversation with Community Leader, Pam Ledbetter. Pam Ledbetter, our moderator for tonight, is the president of Accent Creative Group. Her company has been in business since 2004 and is recognized across the Southeast as a leader for its outstanding marketing and design work. Her business is located in Lawrenceville, Georgia, in an amazing little building. And we are very fortunate to have her with us tonight. She took the time to be here. And without further ado, I give you Pam Ledbetter, president of Accent Creative Group.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. Well, I am really excited about tonight's author and our program. I can assure you that you're in for a great treat, and it couldn't be more fitting because this is Women's History Month. So I'm real excited to introduce you to Dr. Carolyn Curry. She is the founder and director of an organization called Women Alone Together. This organization addresses special needs of women. She'll talk to that later. She published her book, Suffer and Grow Strong, first in 2014, and then republished it, an expanded version, just last year. And she'll share some details on that as well. This book, and Carolyn, has received numerous accolades. She was Georgia Author of the Year in 2015. Also in 2015, she got the 10 books all Georgians should read, and I agree with that, especially women. And most recently, she was Author of the Year from the National League of American Pen Women. I recently saw a review that someone had written about the book, and they said, this is a story every girl should know. I just had to write that down because that's absolutely true, and you'll learn more about that as we talk and chat with Dr. Curry. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolyn Curry. Welcome. I'm excited to have you.
Thank you, Pam. I appreciate it. I am delighted to be at the Gwinnett County Library tonight and to talk about Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas. I have spoken about this woman well over 100 times, believe it or not. I have traveled to Little Rock, Arkansas, to Rochester, New York, Chautauqua, New York, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. It's been an amazing journey. But everywhere I go, except Augusta, Georgia, where this woman was born, I hear, I don't know that woman. I've never heard of her. And it delights me that this is the first biography that has ever been written about her. But she is such an astounding woman and so interesting that I'm honored to be telling her story. She was born in Georgia in 1834 into one of the wealthiest families in our state. Her father owned 12,000 acres of land, 6 plantations, almost 400 slaves. He made his fortune on the back of slave labor, of course, as everyone did back in that day. And she really had a life of leisure, but the Civil War came. And of course, that turned her life upside down. And they lost everything. They went bankrupt. And then it was after the war, when she moved to Atlanta, that she began to be interested in women's causes and what was going on in the world at that time. She became a new woman, and it is an astounding story. And I'm just very fortunate that I got to tell it. Do you want to know how I found it?
And I've got like bukus of questions for you.
Okay.
So I'm excited to get started on those. First thing I want to know is, how did you select Ella Gertrude Thomas as your subject? And can you also share, because I can imagine the amount of research that went into this as I've learned more, can you share some of that that inspired you to write the book?
Well, I was in graduate school at Georgia State University getting my PhD. You know, you have to write a dissertation, and it's like writing a book. And I had gotten so interested in women's stories. This is back, you know, I started in the 70s and the 80s, and this is the women's movement. And I said, I want to find a Georgia woman. And I was very fortunate to have a professor, John Matthews, whose wife worked in the Emory archives, the Emory Library. And she knew about this diary that was in the Duke Library. And this woman kept a diary off and on for 41 years, if you can believe it. And one of her descendants, it had been kept in the family for years, and one of her descendants, her granddaughter, was living in Atlanta, and she had given it to the Duke Library. So he sent me up there. 15 volumes, 450,000 words, if you can believe it. And I've asked so many times, have you ever tried to keep a diary? I've got about 10 that I started. Did one or two nights, and then, you know, I just don't keep it up. But she kept it up off and on for 41 years. She didn't write every day, but she would write the most when something bad happened. Now, we know from counselors and psychologists that if you write it, say it, cry it, talk it out. As you began to study this diary, you realize that she's using her diary as therapy, and she's pouring her anguish into this diary. She, as I say, as a young girl, she's just writing about what she's wearing, and she's writing about a young man who comes and plays a guitar under her window. She's writing about what she's reading. She's a voracious reader. She's reading Dickens. She reads Jane Eyre the first year it comes out. You can tell she's very intelligent, but she has a true life of leisure. And then she goes off to Wesleyan College when she's 15. And Wesleyan was the first college for women in America. And she was one of the first women in Georgia to get a college education. People ask me, well, what would it be like? It would be like an advanced prep school maybe today, but it was so much more than women were getting, because the feeling back then is women didn't need education. Women didn't want education. Women were too emotional. You know, women were supposed to stay in the home. So this was her life. It was what she expected to have her life to be. So she graduates when she's 17, and she gets married when she's 18 the next year. And in her diary, she writes, "This is when my troubles began." So that's not a very good thing to say about your husband. But no, she was very taken with this young man that she married. But 1 year later, she had her first baby. That first pregnancy was fine. Went off, you know, she didn't have any problems. But as women did in the 19th century, they got pregnant again, you know, after so many months. And then she would have a bad miscarriage. And then she would get pregnant again after so many months. And she would give birth, but then the baby would die soon afterwards. And if you can imagine what it would be like to have 10 children and spend most of your life pregnant, she lost at least 2 to miscarriage, 1 stillborn, all of these very, very difficult things that she was going through. And she writes in her diary, like when one of her babies dies, she's a good Methodist woman, and she wants to reconcile it with her Christian beliefs. She writes in the diary, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But oh, it is so hard. Nature is repelled by the thought that tonight my babe will lie its first night in the grave." So she says things like that. And I've actually teared up reading her diary sometime. And I've even been speaking in front of a big audience and can read her words or say her words, and I can choke up, because she put so much emotion into the diary and how she's grieving the loss of these children. And she had a 7-year-old child that she really adored, and she had already lost 3 children. He gets a fever, and then a couple of days later, he dies. They would get fevers, and they didn't know what caused the fever. So this was one of the ways that she suffered. And she began this kind of suffering of losing children and going through these difficult pregnancies, even before the Civil War. And I've said a lot of times that she leaves us the best record of what women went through in childbirth. So I'm sort of not answering your question. I was saying how I went to Duke, found this diary, And I was taken with it immediately because of all these things I'm telling you. So I decided I'm definitely going to write her story. And I'm able to purchase a copy of the diary and bring it back to Atlanta. And I found out that her great granddaughter lived in Atlanta. And so I decided I would go see her. And I had never met her. I just called her on the phone, said, I want to write your grandmother's or great grandmother's life story. And I went to her house and found out that her son was at Georgia Tech. My husband was coaching at Georgia Tech. Found out her cousin was my 7th grade teacher. So we had a lot of little serendipities like that, and we made a connection.
Small world. Yeah.
And very lucky. And then she said, oh, and I've got 15 scrapbooks she kept. And I said, oh no, what?
A gold mine.
A gold mine. And when I say scrapbooks, it was like she glued newspaper articles in these scrapbooks. And it's like if somebody writes you up in the newspaper, you want to keep a clipping. So she glued it in the scrapbook. I knew where she was going, who she was going with, she was speaking to, these various organizations she was interested in. And then I spent a lot of time in the archives of the county Superior Court, the minutes of the Superior Court, because there was a lot of litigation in the family, wills and deeds and lawsuits. And so I worked on it for years, but I did find a treasure trove of information. And if you're going to write a biography of somebody that lived 100 years ago, you've got to find your sources. And so I was very, very fortunate finding her and then having a professor that knew about it, and he sent me in the right direction.
Well, and so now we know why it took you so long to publish from the time you wrote the dissertation.
Well, actually, I published it as my dissertation after working on it for about, 4 or 5 years. And then I just put it up on a shelf. I didn't publish it as a book until, over 20 years later, when a friend that had gone to Wesleyan asked me what I wrote my dissertation on. I said, oh, this woman who went to Wesleyan. She said, I want to read it. And I said, oh, you don't want to read my big old chunky dissertation? She says, oh, I do. When she read it, and bless her heart, she said, Ruth Knox, the president of Wesleyan, needs to know about this woman. So she told her about it, and then Ruth Knox wanted me to come speak at Wesleyan. I was very honored to speak at a convocation. It was their 175th anniversary celebration, and this woman graduated in 1851. So they really wanted to know what was Wesleyan like back then, and she really appreciated her Wesleyan education, had great things to say about Wesleyan. So I shared that with the audience, and then people came up to me afterwards, I want to read your book. I want to read your book. And I said, rather sheepishly, oh, I never published it, and they were scolding me, so I took it to Mercer Press, and they agreed to publish it. But then I had to still do some revisions, so I had to work on it over a year after that. So I know more about this woman than I know about my own mother.
I bet. Well, tell me, why did you name it Suffer and Grow Strong?
Well, I've had a lot of people ask me that. And my publisher, Mercer Press, Mark Jolly, said, Carolyn, what was something sort of, snappy that she said, or something catchy? And I said, she didn't say catchy things. But in her diary, this is a phrase that she would use over and over when she got into, like, she was losing all these babies. And then when the Civil War comes, they're losing property. She is going through one devastation after another. And she has a falling out with her family and some of her family members sue her because her husband borrowed money from her sister and brothers, and when they couldn't pay it back, they would sue. It was really bad. And she said, I wish I could meet some woman who had suffered, some intelligent, strong woman who had suffered and grown strong. And the more I studied about her, the more I realized that she was that woman that had suffered and grown strong. And what happened with all of the difficulties that she had to go through, she was able to come back from those struggles and late in her life, where a lot of people would be destroyed by the bankruptcy by the loss of all those children, go into a permanent depression, she threw herself into activity to help other women, especially after the Civil War, because saw how desperately women needed education, they needed jobs, they needed the vote. And so that's what she did the rest of her life. And so she did indeed suffer, but she did indeed grow strong.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about her early years and the journey that she kind of traveled through?
Okay. Well, her father was Turner Clanton, and he was a member of the Georgia legislature. And he was, as I've already told you, he was one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. They lived in a big mansion on Center Street in Augusta. And her mother was a true Southern lady. When we say a Southern lady, she gave birth 11 times. As you know, women had 10, 11, 12 babies back in those days. And then she managed the plantation. She took care of her family and their slave family. She was very, very busy. But this young lady just had a life of leisure, and she could do anything she wanted, and she had anything she wanted. Uh, she used to say that she wanted to wear a different dress every day. She was spoiled because of that wealth and privilege. Um, so in her early days, but she writes about that, and it's interesting to find out how she lived. But it was interesting her relationship with her slaves and there was a young slave named Amanda, and she was always writing about Amanda, and Amanda would accompany her places, and I couldn't tell who. At first, I couldn't tell was Amanda a cousin or a relative or a slave, and I figured out later that she was a slave. So she had very close relationships always with the slaves, and then later in her life, as an adult, she's going to begin to question the morality of slavery.
Awesome, awesome. Well, and speaking of that, tell us a little bit about her relationship with her husband.
That's real interesting. Uh, Her husband, J. Jefferson Thomas, went to Princeton. Um, Many of the wealthy plantation owners sent their sons to Princeton, and he graduated at Princeton, came home, and she went to college at Wesleyan with his sister, Julie. That's how she met Jeff. And she was really taken with him. And she describes they would have she would go visit at his plantation, and they'd go horseback riding. And she talks about dinners that they had. And then she had a debut party where 300 people were invited to her debut party. And she wore this beautiful dress. And I mean, it was just, storybook elaborate. And she's so crazy about this man. Well, they get married, start having these babies. And of course, Jeff joins the Confederate Army. And he is going to be an officer in the Confederate Army. He actually belongs to Cobb's Legion, a very famous division of soldiers in Georgia. He goes to Virginia, but he is only there 9 months. He buys a substitute. Now,
Which I never knew you could do that.
yes, wealthy men
Okay.
in the South and the North could buy a substitute for $300. So he paid a man from Maryland $300 to go fight for him, and he came home. Well, Gertrude was somewhat embarrassed by that, but because she really threw herself into the war effort, trying to help in the Ladies' League, and they would make food, the soldiers that came through the train station in Augusta, and she didn't like to sew. She just didn't have a talent for that, but she would sew for the troops. That's what women did to help the war effort. And so she threw herself into all those efforts. And she says in the diary, somewhat, that I can't see belonging to this local militia being anything to brag about, or, she was sort of put off by that. But for the last 3 years of the war, he was home, and he began to drink a lot. And we know that family tradition has it that he developed an alcohol problem. and drank quite heavily. And she used to say they got in excited conversations. That's how she described an argument. You know, she was too ladylike to say they got in an argument. We had a very excited conversation about his drinking and his bad language. So you begin to see these hints of trouble in paradise, so to speak, so that late in their life, you begin to wonder what he thought about all of her work that she was doing for women, for women's rights. Did her joining the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which we can talk about in a minute, which was such an organization back then, did his drinking and his profanity, and see, he was such a poor businessman. So many men lost everything after the Civil War, but you do have some examples of some men being very frugal and holding on to some property or being able to hire workers. But he didn't have, they had land after the war. But if you don't have anybody to work the land, and if you don't have enough money to pay them to work the land, your money, your land's not going to make any difference. So they began to, she began to lose respect for him. And she tried to make suggestions about let's mortgage this and let's rent this property out. But he would never listen to her because she was a woman. And, you know, women should be involved with domestic issues and not anything about public issues. And he was going to run the plantation and he didn't need her advice. So that was their relationship. Yeah, that was their relationship.
Perfect lead in. I would love for you to elaborate on her involvement with the women's suffrage, what her role was and involvement in that.
Well, I'll start with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which leads into the suffrage movement. See, after the Civil War in the South and in Atlanta particularly, you saw devastation. You know, Sherman had his famous march through Georgia where he's burning everything and tearing up the railroad tracks. And women desperately needed an education. They needed jobs, and women were seeing this. And there was a surplus of women after the Civil War, a scarcity of men because so many men had been killed in the war. And if they came home, they were very often maimed, crippled, and probably suffering from post-traumatic stress, as we say today. So he was having all of those problems, and she wanted to do something. And the women that started getting interested in the women's rights movement in the South started in the churches because that was an appropriate place for women to go. You know, this women's rights movement that started in the North with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that was associated with the abolitionist movement. And we didn't have the abolitionist movement, of course, down here. So when these women wanted to do something, they wanted to help the desperate situation out there, they started tentatively in little church groups. And what did they do? They learned they could raise money. They learned they could have a bake sale even, or, you know, they would have bazaars and well, we can make money. And then that we needed to start an orphanage or we need to start a school. I mean, these women organized and they really got out there. And so this was the mood when a woman named Frances Willard came south. She was from Illinois and she had started the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she came south recruiting women, telling them about this organization. And when I speak to a live group, I very often say, every woman here would have been in the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the late 19th century because it was very popular. It was what women did. You got on your hat, you got on your gloves, and you got all dressed up in your Sunday best, and you went to the Women's Christian Temperance Union meeting, and they were fighting demon rum, the evils of alcohol. It was, and you can see though, if you read their writing, they're really talking about the impact that the abuse of alcohol had on women, because men didn't bring their money home. They spent it on alcohol. They were abusing their wife, beating her. Gertrude
Yeah.
wrote an article one time about wife beating and how cruel it was. And it was not against the law to beat your wife unless the rule of thumb, if your rod was no bigger than, I mean, yeah, it had to be
No bigger than
bigger
thumb.
than your thumb. You could beat your wife with that rod. So it was horrible. And so she started recognizing that. And so she went to South Carolina to hear Frances Willard speak about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it was like a religious conversion for Gertrude. She just got so enthusiastic. And, you know, very often people say, well, did they have it back home? Well, yes, she did have it back home with her husband. He had a drinking problem. So she was passionate about this. So she became president of the organization in Augusta and very, very active. And then when they lost all their property and they came to Atlanta to live with one of their adult children after they went bankrupt, she stays in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union would meet in the churches, ministers would announce the meeting, and they were approved by the church and the community. And those women started talking about, we need the vote. We need the power that comes with the vote. And we should start working for that. And that was a no-no because it was radical. And I've quoted Warren Candler of the Methodist Church saying that he and his wife had gone to Women's Christian Temperance Union meetings. He had let them meet in his church and he condoned it. But once they started talking about the vote, no. He said suffrage for women is not only not scriptural, it is sinful. So if you've got ministers in the pulpit saying the vote is sinful, and J.D. Hawthorne was the minister of the First Baptist Church in Atlanta. And when there was a big suffrage meeting in Atlanta, he said, any man that lets his wife participate in suffrage is simple-minded. So, see, the men are discouraging their women from participating. They're getting criticism from the pulpit. And so it really took
It's hard.
much courage for these women to say that, okay, it doesn't matter. I know women need to vote and I'm going to stand up for it. And in 1895, there was a very historic meeting in Atlanta. The national organization of the National Suffrage Association decided to have their national convention in Atlanta. And you say, why did they have it in Atlanta? There were no suffrage groups down here. That's exactly why they had it here. They were trying to get attention and they were trying to get women in the southern states to start suffrage groups. And they wanted to support them. And so they came in 1895, and that's when Candler and Hawthorne and all these ministers were attacking them. And the Atlanta paper, the Atlanta Journal came out with, we extend to you our Southern hospitality, but we do not approve the vote. No, so they did not endorse the vote for women. So that's what is so amazing. We take the vote so for granted.
Yeah.
But these women really had to fight for it, and it took a lot of courage. It took a long time.
Perseverance, determination. I heard you say on another interview about their vinegar.
Yeah, that's you had to have vinegar. Yes, that my mother one time, my grandfather said to my mother when she had done something and sort of spoken up, he said, "You've got a little vinegar in you. You had to have a little vinegar. You had to have gumption, you know." Gumption. That's what we say in the South. You had to have gumption, and these women certainly had it.
Awesome. Well, last year you came out with your expanded edition, which I'm happy to say I have. And that aligned with the 100th anniversary for the Vote for Women. So if you can expand on that a little bit, and then you also have a special photo or painting in your foyer that I'd love for you to share with us as well.
Okay, this is the gold seal that's on the expanded version. And it says, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Vote for Women. My publisher asked me when the 2020 was coming up, that Gertrude died in 1907. All of these women, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Gertrude Thomas, these women that had worked for years to get the vote for women, died. And in Gertrude, as I was saying, she went from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was one of those women that was strong enough to join the suffrage effort. And she became president of the embryonic Georgia Women's Suffrage Association in 1899. She was 65 years old. She was at the end of, not really the end of her life. She died when she was 73, which is very young to me. But that was the pinnacle of her life when she was elected to the suffrage presidency of Georgia. But my publisher said, tell us about the fight. What went on after that? And I said, I jumped at it. I said, I would love to, because one thing that I learned going around the country, telling her story and talking about how difficult winning suffrage was, I learned that so many people do not know the stories. Like when all these women died, they were worried, who's going to pick up the torch? What's going to happen to the movement? Are they going to keep working? Well, Carrie Chapman Catt in 1900, this Gertrude went to Washington, D.C. for the National Convention of the Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony, who was in her 80s by this time, passed the torch to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was only 41. And she was one of the women who carried on the fight. And remember, when they were working, they went state by state by state. And these women were trying to convince the male legislators in each state to vote, to give women the vote. And it was a hard fight, so that when Elizabeth Cady Stanton died, only 4 states, Western states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, had given the vote to women. So Carrie Chapman Catt, who had taken over from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they just kept doing it the same way. And then along came a young woman named Alice Paul, who was a brilliant woman, very well educated. She had her PhD, she got a law degree. She went to England to study at the London School of Economics, and she saw what they were doing in London, and they were doing it differently. In England, they were doing parades, and they were trying to convince the prime minister to go to Parliament and encourage Parliament to vote and have it as a national measure. So that's what Alice Paul and these young women in the beginning of the 20th century started doing. Let's say, let's go for a national amendment and let's have parades. So that, you know, and you see the suffrage women with their banners, and you see they had a fabulous parade in 1913 on the eve of the inaugural of Woodrow Wilson. And they had thousands of women in this parade, all over the United States. They had floats. They had, each state had an assembly of women. Just big, big, big. 250,000 people watched the parade. So that when Woodrow Wilson came to the train station, he said, "Where are the people?" Yeah. And they said, "They're at the suffrage parade." Yay. So they really got attention. And they were working to get Wilson's attention, to get him to go to the House of Representatives and the Senate. Well, to make a long story short, the whole first term, they would meet with him, they would have these parades, they couldn't get Wilson's attention. Okay, for his second term, starting in 1917, even though the war is going on, they start picketing the White House. 1,000 women circled the White House, starting at 10 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. And they carried these big banners quoting Wilson's words. They would quote Wilson's words about democracy and the importance of democracy. And they would say, but women, we don't have it. We don't have freedom. And they were working on Woodrow Wilson. And so this went on for a very long time. I'm making a long story sort of short. But finally, the Russian delegation came to see Woodrow Wilson. And they had just given the vote to women in Russia. And these women picketing the White House had these huge banners that said, 20 million women in America do not have the vote. And Wilson had security go out and arrest these women for obstructing traffic. And they weren't obstructing traffic. They hadn't been doing anything illegal. And they started sending these women to jail for 3 days or a $25 fine. These women would not pay their fines. They'd rather go to jail. And so then they get out of jail, then they go right back to start picketing again. And so Wilson finally agreed after in 1919 that he would go to the House after the war and women's volunteer activities in war. They finally won Wilson down. And he said they really didn't, but they did. But he encouraged the House to pass it, and the House passed it. But then they couldn't get the Senate to pass it because of the Southern Bloc. The old states of the Confederacy were blocking it. They were, remember that we didn't have women's rights groups down here and suffrage down here in the South. They were blocking it. And so it still took over a year to get the Senate to pass it. And then they passed it. And then what do you have to do to get an amendment to the Constitution? They had to get 36 states to ratify. And that's a wonderful story about how most of the northern states ratified it like that. And then to get 36, they were going to have to get some of those southern states. Well, Georgia was the first state that refused to ratify. And I want y'all to know that Georgia did not ratify the 19th Amendment until 1970.
Which is so crazy. Not that long ago.
Mississippi didn't ratify until 1984. But I mean, women had the vote, but it wasn't on the books of the state. Women wanted the symbolic, effort. But at any rate, Georgia refused. Most of the southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, and all these states refused to ratify. But Tennessee and North Carolina were having a special convention. They only needed one more state. So all these suffrage women converged on Nashville, and they're pinning red roses on the lapel of the men who opposed the vote for women. And they were organized. There were a lot of men and women even that were opposed. The suffrage, if you were for suffrage, you put a yellow rose. The yellow rose was the color of suffrage. The yellow rose was the flower. So it's coming right down to the vote, and it's like a tie. And the youngest man in the legislature in Tennessee was a man named Harry Burns. And he got a telegram from his mother. And his mother said, he was wearing a red rose, by the way. He was not going to vote for it. She said, be a good boy and vote for suffrage.
Listen to your mother.
Listen to your mother. And he changed the red rose, put on a yellow rose, voted for suffrage, and Tennessee passed it by one vote. And Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment. It's a wonderful story. And if you go to Nashville, there's a big plaque out by this hotel where all this happened about this convention and how it went down to the wire. And now I understand that there's a statue that's been put up because it's such a wonderful story. And the women of Tennessee and the country really are proud of what Tennessee did. And that was one of the Confederate states that had been opposed, but they came around and were the ones who passed it. And then,
well, thank goodness for Mama.
That's right. Thank goodness for Mama.
That's right. Well, quick question for you. Are you working on any other biographies now?
Well, you're not going to believe this. I'm not working on a biography. I am working on a novel. It's my first novel. Wow. And I've been working on it for about a year. And my husband was a football coach. He's now retired, but it's a football coach's wife that writes this. It's a mystery, and you will just have to wait and see.
Now we're anxious to see it.
So I always talk about strong women, and it is a fiction. It's not me, and the coach in it is not my husband, and it is truly a fiction. but they're two really strong women in the book. So I can't write a book without strong women, you know.
Yeah. No, I love that about you. Well, in fact, I think that this book, Suffer and Grow Strong, would be a perfect mini series, a TV mini series.
Okay, I have had
I-
other people say that, and she's been compared to Scarlett OHara. And Pat Conroy was kind enough to write a nice blurb for my book, and he said that she reminded him of Scarlett OHara. And you know, she's beautiful, and this is a beautiful portrait of her. And she was feisty, and she was hardworking, and she would never give up. But I laughingly say, when people try to compare her to Scarlett OHara, I say the difference between Gertrude and Scarlett OHara is that Gertrude had a conscience.
yes, very true.
And Gertrude wanted to do the right thing. And you remember Scarlett would take her sister's fiance. I mean, she would do
Whatever it
anything,
took.
but whatever it took. But Gertrude was a good Methodist. She joined the First Methodist Church of Atlanta in 1980. I say 1894. I have to get my centuries correct, right? When she moved to Atlanta, she joined the First Methodist Church. And so she was always a good Methodist woman, and she wanted to do the right thing. She would never have done some of the things Scarlett did. But I mean, she worked, and she was tough, and she traveled, and she spoke up. She had gumption.
Yes, I love it. That's a word I'm going to be saying for the next few weeks. Well, I have one last question. So we have time for one last question. And it is, how do our viewers that are watching tonight learn a little bit more about the organization that you founded and how they might be able to support it or be involved in?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. My organization is entitled Women Alone Together. And you can go to womenalonetogether.org, womenalonetogether.org. And I have been doing this now for 19 years. And I partner with the Agnes Scott Alumni Association. I went to Agnes Scott in undergraduate, and we try to help women who are alone for any reason: death of spouse, divorce of spouse, alone by choice, meaning they've never married, or alone in a marriage because of separation, disease, or estrangement. However, all women are invited. And so it's really an organization. What we do a book program once a month. And like on our Zooms, we've had huge crowds for our book program. And, you know, a library, we love books. And then we do seminars in health and wellness, legal, financial, and emotional personal growth issues. So I've been doing that, like I say, for 19 years now. And anyone can go to the website, and anyone can join. You know, a lot of people say, well, what do you have to do? You don't have to pay anything. It's free. It's a nonprofit. And see what our programs are, and join in. Like our book programs are the second Thursday of every month. And we usually have an author or a professor talking about a book.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. I have thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you, reading your book. It's been such a pleasure, and anything that inspires in women, and we all together, I don't know, strong. We all got gumption, right?
Yeah, right. You got to have gumption. Well, this woman has been a real influence to me. And like you say, I do have her portrait hanging in my foyer. And my husband goes by there and asks her questions every now and then. What do you think, Gertrude?
Love it. I love it.
Ladies, we loved hearing you talk. You have a beautiful rapport. Thank you so much for taking the time to come tonight, Pam. We appreciate you and all you do for the Gwinnett Library System. Pam is very active in Gwinnett County. If a cause is worthy, Pam has her finger in it.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for taking the time to do the interview.
Absolutely.
Yes, and Carolyn,
My pleasure.
you got a promise to come when that book is out and do a live program, and we'll let Pam introduce you in person from the stage.
Okay.
I want to be the
really
first to read it.
Excited about this book, and I don't want to give too much away because it is a mystery. And I've gotten good response from some of my readers, and I'm learning that writing fiction is different from writing history. Some of the same things are involved, but I'm calling it my COVID-19 novel. It kept me busy all during this COVID stuff.
That's great.
Yes.
That's great.
Well, thank you to our guests as well. I wish you all a pleasant good evening, and thank you again, Carolyn and Pam. And all.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly
Good
enjoyed it.
night.
Good
Goodbye.
night.